War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, Part 5 of my reading of the complete novel. Chapter 11 At the Window. I have already said that my storms of emotions have a trick of exhausting themselves. After a time, I discovered that I was cold and wet, and with little pools of water about me on the stair carpet. I got up almost mechanically, went into the dining room and drank some whiskey, and then I was moved to change my clothes. After I had done that, I went upstairs to my study. But why I did so I do not know. The window of my study looked over the trees and the railway towards Horsham Common. In the hurry of our departure, that this window had been left open. The passage was dark, and by contrast with the picture, the window frame enclosed. The side of the room seemed impenetrably dark. I stopped short in the doorway. The thunderstorm had passed, the towers of the Oriental College and the pine trees about it had gone, and very far away, lit by a vivid red glare, the common about the sand pits was visible. Across the light, huge black shapes, grotesque and strange, moved busily to and fro. It seemed indeed as if the whole country in that direction was on fire. A broad hillside set with a minute tongues of flames, swaying and writhing with the gusts of the dying storm, and throwing a red reflection upon the cloud scud above. Every now and then a haze of smoke from some nearer conflagration drove across the window and hid the Martian shapes. I could not see what they were doing, nor clear the forms of them, nor recognize the black objects they busied upon. Neither could I see the nearer fire. Through the reflections of it danced on the walls and ceilings of the study. A sharp tang of burning was in the air. I closed the door noiselessly and crept toward the window. As I did so, the view opened up until, on the one hand, it reached to the house about the Woking station, and on the other to the charred and blackened pine woods of Byfleet. There was a light down below the hill on the railway near the arch, and several of the houses along Maybury Road and the streets near the station were glowing ruins. The light upon the railway puzzled me at first. There was a black heap and a vivid glare, and to the right of that row of yellow oblongs. Then I perceived that this was a wrecked train, the fore part smashed and on fire, the hinder carriages still upon the rails. Between these three main centers of light, the houses, the train, and the burning country towards Chobham, stretched irregular patches of dark country, broken here and there by intervals of dimly glowing and smoking ground. It was the strangest spectacle. The black expanse set with fire. It reminded me, more than anything else, of the potteries at night. At first I could distinguish no people at all, though I peered intently for them. Later I saw against the light of Woking station a number of black figures hurrying one after the other across the line, and this was the little world in which I had been living securely for years, this fiery chaos. What had happened in the last 7 hours I still do not know, nor did I know, though I was beginning to guess the relation between these mechanical colossi and the sluggish lumps I had seen disengorged from the cylinder. With a queer feeling of impersonal interest, I turned my desk chair to the window, sat down, and stared at the blackened country, and particularly at three gigantic black things that were going to and fro in the glare above the sand pits. They seemed amazingly busy. I began to ask myself what they could be. Were they intelligent mechanisms? Such a thing I felt was impossible. Or did a Martian sit within each, ruling, directing, using much as a man's brain sits and rules in his body? I began to compare these things to human machines, to ask myself for the first time in my life how ironclad or a steam engine would seem to an intelligent lower animal. The storm had left the sky clear, and over the smoke of the burning land, the little fading pinpoint of Mars was dropping into the west. When a soldier came into my garden, I heard a slight scraping at the fence, and rousing myself from the lethargy that had fallen upon me, I looked down and saw him dimly, clambering over the over the palings. At the sight of another human being, my torpor passed, and I leaned out of the window eagerly. "Hist!" said I in a whisper. He stopped astride of the fence in doubt. Then he came over and across the lawn to the corner of the house. He bent down and stepped softly. "Who's there?" he said, also whispering, standing under the window and peering up. "Where are you going?" I asked. "God knows." "Are you trying to hide?" "That's it." "Come into the house," I said. I went down and fastened the door and let him in, and locked the door again. I could not see his face. It was hatless, and his coat was unbuttoned. "My God," he said as I drew him in. "What has happened?" I asked. "What hasn't?" In the obscurity, I could see he had made a gesture of despair. "They wiped us out. Simply wiped us out," he repeated again and again. He followed me almost mechanically into the dining room. "Take some whiskey," I said, pouring out a stiff dose. He drank it, then abruptly he sat down before the table, put his head on his arms, and began to sob and weep like a little boy in a perfect passion of emotion, while I, with a curious forgetfulness in my own recent despair, stood beside him wondering. It was a long time before he could steady his nerves to answer my questions, and then he answered perplexedly and brokenly. He was a driver in the artillery, had only come into action about 7. At that time firing was going on across the common, and it was said that the first party of Martians were crawling slowly toward their second cylinder under a cover of metal shield. Later, this shield staggered upon a tripod legs and began the first of the fighting machines I had seen. The gun he drove had been unlimbered near Horschel in order to command the sandpits, and its arrival it was that had precipitated the action. As the limber gunners went to the rear, his horse trod in a rabbit hole and came down, throwing him into a depression of the ground. At the same moment, the gun exploded behind him. The ammunition blew up. There was fire all about him, and he found himself lying under a heap of charred dead men and dead horses. "I lay still," he said, "scared out of my wits, with the fore quarter of a horse atop of me. We'd been wiped out, and the smell, good Lord, like burnt meat. I was hurt across the back by the fall of the horse, and there I had to lie until I felt better. Just like a parade, it had been a minute before, then stumble, bang, swish, wiped out," he said. He had hid under the dead horse for a long time, peeping out furtively across the common. The Cardigan men had tried a rush in skirmishing order at the pit, simply to be swept out of existence. Then the monster had risen to its feet, and had begun to walk leisurely to and fro across the common among the few fugitives, with its head-like hood turning about exactly like the head of a cowled human being. A kind of arm carried a complicated metallic case about which green flashes, and out of the funnel of this there smoked the heat ray. In a few minutes there was, so far as the soldier could see, not a living thing left upon the common, and every bush and tree upon it had that was not already blackened skeleton was burning. He heard the Maximus rattle for a long time, and then became still. The giant saved Woking Station and its cluster of houses until the last. Then in a moment the heat ray was brought to bear, and the town became a heap of fiery ruins. Then the thing shut off the heat ray, and turning its back upon the artilleryman, began to waddle away towards the smoldering pine woods that sheltered the second cylinder. As it did so, a second glittering titan built itself up out of the pit. The second monster followed the first. At that, the artilleryman began to crawl very cautiously across the hot heather ash towards Horschel. He managed to get alive into the ditch by the side of the road, and so escaped to Woking. There his story became the place was impassable, it seems. There were a few people alive there, frantic for the most part, and many burned and scalded. He was turned aside by the fire and hid among some almost scorching heaps of broken walls as one of the Martian giants returned. He saw this one pursue a man, catch him up in one of its steely tentacles, and knock his head against the trunk of a pine tree. At last, after nightfall, the artilleryman had made a rush for it and got over the railway embankment. Since then he had been skulking along towards Maybury in hope of getting out of danger London ward. People were hiding in trenches and cellars, and many of the survivors had made off towards Woking village and Sind. He had been consumed with thirst until he found one of the water mains near the railway arch smashed, and the water bubbling out like a spring upon the road. That was the story I got from him, bit by bit. He grew calmer, telling me and trying to make me see the things he had seen. He had eaten no food since midday, he told me early in his narrative, and I found some mutton and bread in the pantry and brought it into the room. We lit no lamp for fear of attracting the Martians, and ever and again our hands would touch upon bread or meat. As he talked things about us darkly out of the darkness, and the trampled bushes and broken rose trees outside the window grew distinct. It would seem that a number of men or animals had rushed across the lawn. I began to see his face, blackened and haggard, and as no doubt mine was also. We had finished eating, and we went softly upstairs to my study, and I looked again out the open window. In one night the valley had become a valley of ashes. The fires had dwindled now. Where flames had been, there were now streamers of smoke, but the countless ruins of shattered and gutted houses and blasted and blackened trees that the night had hidden stood out now gaunt and terrible in the pitiless light of dawn. Yet here and there some objects had the luck to escape. A white railway signal here, the end of a greenhouse there, white and fresh amid the wreckage. Never before in the history of warfare had destruction been so indiscriminate and so universal. And shining with the growing light of the east, three of the metallic giants stood about the pit, their cowls rotating as though they were surveying the desolation they had made. It seemed to me that the pit had enlarged, and ever and again puffs of vivid green vapor streamed up and out of it toward the brightening dawn. Streamed up, whirled, broke, and vanished. Beyond were the pillars of fire about Chopin. They became pillars of bloodshot smoke at the first touch of the day. Chapter 12. What I saw of the destruction of Weybridge and Sherpton. As the dawn grew brighter, we withdrew from the window from which we had watched the Martians and went very quietly downstairs. The artilleryman agreed with me that the house was no place to stay in. He proposed, he said, to make his way Londonward and thence rejoin his battery, number 12, of the horse artillery. My plan was to return at once to Leatherhead, and so greatly had the strength of the Martians impressed me that I had determined to take my wife to New Haven and go with her out of the country forthwith, for I already perceived clearly that the country about London must inevitably be the scene of a disastrous struggle before such creatures as these could be destroyed. Between us and Leatherhead, however, lay the third cylinder, with its guarding giants. Had I been alone, I think I should have taken my chance and struck across country, but the artilleryman dissuaded me. It's no kindness to the right sort of wife, he said, to make her a widow, and in the end I agreed to go with him under the cover of the woods, northwood as far as northward as far as the street Coham before I parted with him. Thence I could make a big detour by Epsom to reach Leatherhead. I should have started at once, but my companion had been in active service, and he knew better than that. He made me ransack the house for a flask, which he filled with whiskey, and we lined every available pocket with packets of biscuits and slices of meat. Then we crept out of the house and ran as quickly as we could down the ill-made road by which I had come overnight. The houses seemed deserted. In the road lay a group of three charred bodies close together, struck dead by the heat ray, and here and there were things that people had dropped: a clock, a slipper, a silver spoon, and the like poor valuables. At the corner, turning up towards the post office, a little cart, filled with boxes and furniture and horseless, heeled over on a broken wheel. A cash box had been hastily smashed open and thrown under the debris. Except the lodge at the orphanage, which was still on fire, none of the houses had suffered very greatly here. The heat wave had shaved the chimney tops and passed. Yet, save ourselves, there did not seem to be a living soul on Mayberry Hill. The majority of the inhabitants had escaped, I suppose, by the way of Old Woking Road, the road I had taken when I drove to Leatherhead, or they had hidden. We went down the lane by the body of the man in the black sodden now from the overnight hail and broke into the woods at the foot of the hill. We pushed through these towards the railway without meeting a soul. The woods across the line were but the scarred and blackened ruins of woods. For the most part, the trees had fallen, but a certain proportion still stood, dismal gray stems with dark brown foliage instead of green. On our side, the fire had done no more than scorch the nearer trees. It had fallen to secure its footing. In one place, the woodmen had been at work on Saturday. Trees felled and freshly trimmed lay in a clearing, with heaps of sawdust by the sawing machine and its engine. Hard by was the temporary hut deserted. There was not a breath of wind this morning, and everything was strangely still. Even the birds were hushed, and as we hurried along, I and the artilleryman talked in whispers and looked now and again over our shoulders. Once or twice we stopped to listen. After a time we drew near the road. As we did so, we heard the clatter of hoofs and saw through the tree stems three cavalry soldiers riding slowly towards Woking. We hailed them, and they halted while we hurried towards them. It was a lieutenant and a couple of privates on of the 8th Hussars, with a stand like a theolite, which the artilleryman told me was a heliograph. "You are the first men I've seen coming this way this morning," said the lieutenant. "What's brewing?" His voice and face were eager. The men behind him stared curiously. The artilleryman jumped down the bank into the road and saluted. "Gun destroyed last night, sir. Have been hiding. Trying to rejoin battery, sir. You you'll come inside of the Martians, I expect, about half a mile along this road." "What the dickens are they like?" asked the lieutenant. "Giants in armor, sir, 100 feet high, 3 legs and a body like aluminum, with a mighty great head and a hood, sir." "Get out," said the lieutenant. "What confounded nonsense!" "You'll see, sir. They carry a kind of box, sir, that shoots fire and strikes you dead." "What d'ye mean, a gun?" "No, sir," said the artilleryman, began a vivid account of the heat ray. Halfway through, the lieutenant interrupted him and looked up at me. I was still standing on the bank by the side of the road. "It's perfectly true," I said. "Well," said the lieutenant, "I suppose it's my business to see it too. Look here," to the artilleryman. "We're detailed here clearing people out of their houses. You better go along and report yourself to the Brigadier General Marvin, and to tell him all you know. He's at Weybridge. Know the way?" "I do," I said, and he turned his horse southward again. "Half a mile, you say?" said he. "At most," I answered, and pointed over the treetops southward. He thanked me and rode on, and we saw them no more. Further along we came upon a group of 3 women and 2 children in the road, busy clearing out a laborer's cottage. They got hold of a little hand truck and were piling it up with unclean-looking bundles and shabby furniture. They were all too assiduously engaged to talk to us, and we passed. By Byfleet Station we emerged from the pine trees and found the country calm and peaceful under the morning sunlight. We were far beyond the range of the heat ray there, and had it not been for the silent desertion of some of the houses, the stirring movement of packing in others, and the knot of soldiers standing on the bridge over the railway and staring down the line towards Woking. The day would have seemed very like any other Sunday. Several farm wagons and carts were moving creakily along the road to Addlestone, and suddenly, through the gate of a field, we saw, across a stretch of flat meadow, six 12-pounders standing neatly at equal distance pointing towards Woking. The gunners stood by the guns waiting, and the ammunition wagons were there at businesslike distance. The men stood almost as if under inspection. That's good, said I. They will get one fair shot at any rate. The artilleryman hesitated at the gate. I shall go on, he said. Farther on towards Weybridge, just over the bridge, there was a number of men in white fatigue jackets throwing up a long rampart, and more guns behind. It's bows and arrows against the lightning, anyhow, said the artilleryman. There haven't seen that fire beam yet. The officers who were not actively engaged stood and stared over the treetops southward, and the men digging would stop every now and again to stare in the same direction. Byfleet was in a tumult, people packing, and a score of hushers, some of them dismounted, some on horseback, were hunting them about. Three or four black government wagons with crosses in white circles and an old omnibus, among other vehicles, were being loaded in the village street. There were scores of people, most of them sufficiently sabbatical to have assumed their best clothes. The soldiers were having the greatest difficulty in making them realize the gravity of their position. We saw one shriveled old fellow with a huge box and a score of more of flower pots containing orchids angrily expostulating with the corporal who would leave them behind. I stopped and gripped his arm. Do you know what's over there? I said, pointing at the pine tops that hid the Martians. He said, turning. I was explaining that these are valuable. Death, I shouted. Death is coming. Death. And leaving him to digest that if he could, I hurried on after the artilleryman. At the corner, I looked back. The soldier had left him, and he was standing by his box with the pots of orchids on the lid of it, staring vaguely over the trees. No one in Weybridge could tell us where the headquarters were established. The whole place was in such confusion as I had never seen in any town before. Carts, carriages everywhere. The most astonishing miscellanea of conveyances and horseflesh. The respectable inhabitants of the place, men in golf and boating costumes, wives prettily dressed, were packing, riverside loafers energetically helping, children excited and for the most part highly delighted at this astonishing variation of their Sunday experiences. In the midst of all, the worthy vicar was very pluckily holding an eerily celebration, and his bell was jangling out above the excitement. I and the artilleryman seated on the step of the drinking fountain made a very passable meal upon us what we had brought with us. Patrols of soldiers, here no longer hushers, but grenadiers in white, were warning people to move now or take refuge in their cellars as soon as the firing began. We saw as we crossed the railway bridge that a growing crowd of people had assembled in and about the railway station, and the swarming platform was piled with boxes and packages. The ordinary traffic had been stopped, I believe, in order to allow the passage of troops and guns to Chesterton, and I have heard since that a savage struggle occurred for places in the special trains that were put on at a later hour. We remained at Weybridge until midday, and at that hour we found ourselves at the place near Shepperton Lock, where the Wey and the Thames join. Part of the time we spent helping two old women to pack a little cart. The Wey had a treble mouth, and at this point boats were to be hired, and there was a ferry across the river. On the Shepperton side was an inn with a lawn. Beyond that was a tower of Shepperton Church. It had once been replaced by a spire, rose above the trees. Here we found an excited and noisy crowd of fugitives, and yet light had not grown to a panic. But there was already far more people than all the boats going to and fro could enable to cross. People came panting along under heavy burdens. One husband and wife were even carrying a small outhouse door between them, with some of their household goods piled thereon. One man told us he meant to try to get away from Shepperton Station. There was a lot of shouting, and one man was even jesting. The idea people seemed to have that to have here was that Martians were simply formidable human beings, which who might attack and sack the town, to be certainly destroyed in the end. Every now and then people would glance nervously across the way at the meadows toward Chesterty, but everything over there was still. Across the Thames, except just where the boats landed, everything was quiet in vivid contrast with the Surrey side. The people who landed there from the boats were tramping off down the lane. The big ferry boat had just made a journey. 3 or 4 soldiers stood on the lawn of the inn, staring and jesting at the fugitives without offering to help. The inn was closed, as it was now within prohibited hours. "What's that?" cried a boatman, and "Shut up, you fool," said a man near me to a yelping dog. Then the sound came again, this time from the direction of Chesterty, a muffled thud, the sound of a gun. The fighting was beginning. Almost immediately, unseen batteries across the river to our right, unseen because of the trees, took up the chorus, firing heavily, one after the other. A woman screamed. Everyone stood arrested by the sudden stir of battle. Near us and yet invisible to us, nothing was to be seen save flat meadows, cows feeding unconcernedly for the most part, and silvery pollard willows motionless in the warm sunlight. "The soldiers will stop 'em," said a woman beside me, doubtfully. A hazing a haziness rose over the treetops. Then suddenly we saw a rush of smoke far away up the river, a puff of smoke that jerked up into the air and hung, and forthwith the ground heaved under the foot, and a heavy explosion shook the air, smashing 2 or 3 windows in the houses near, and leaving us astonished. "Here they are!" shouted a man in a blue jersey. "Yonder day! See them? Yonder!" Quickly, one after the other, 1, 2, 3, 4 of the armored Martians appeared, far away over the little trees across the flat meadow that stretched towards Chesterty, and stirring hurriedly towards the river. Little cowed figures they seemed at first, going with the rolling motion as fast as flying birds. Then advancing obliquely towards us came a fifth. Their armored bodies glittered in the sun, and they swept swiftly forward upon the guns, growing rapidly larger as they drew nearer. One on the extreme left, the remotest, that is, flourished a huge case high in the air, and the ghostly, terrible heat ray I had already seen on Friday night smote towards Chesterfield and struck the town.